"You will marry the Duke of Brentwood in a fortnight, Thalia. The matter is settled." Lady Thalia Windermere's fingers trembled against the mahogany table as her father's declaration echoed through the dining room. The morning sunlight streaming through tall windows did nothing to warm the chill that settled in her bones. "Father, please. The Duke is 63 years old." Baron Windermere slammed his fist on the table, making the silverware clatter. "And I am drowning in debt. Do you understand? The Duke has offered to clear every last shilling I owe in exchange for your hand. So I am to be sold like cattle at market," Thalia whispered, raising her gaze to meet her father's. "Is my happiness worth so little?" "Happiness?" The Baron's laugh was bitter. "Luxury, title, and security are what matter. The Duke can provide all three. You should be grateful." Thalia pushed away from the table and stood, her knees weak, but her resolve hardening. "I would rather work as a scullery maid than be that man's wife." "You know nothing of the world, foolish girl." Her father turned away, signaling the end of discussion. "The Duke will call tomorrow to finalize arrangements. You will be present and you will be gracious." That night, as moonlight filtered through her bedroom curtains, Thalia made her decision. Her lady's maid, Eliza, had already helped pack a small bundle containing only essentials, a simple dress, undergarments, and the pearl necklace that had belonged to her mother. "The Madingley spring ball is tomorrow evening, my lady," Eliza whispered. "Everyone will be attending. It's your chance." "And you're certain your cousin can help me find employment?" Thalia asked, pinning her long auburn hair beneath a plain bonnet. "Martha has been housekeeper at Blackthorn Manor for 15 years. She says they need another chambermaid, and with the reference letter I've written, you'll have the position." Eliza hesitated. "Though I still don't understand why you won't go to your aunt in Cornwall." "The first place father will look," Thalia replied. "No one would think to search for Baron Windermere's daughter among the servants of a neighbouring estate." The Madingley ball was in full swing when Thalia slipped in through the servants' entrance. Dressed in borrowed finery, Eliza's Sunday best with subtle alterations, she could pass for a merchant's daughter, respectable enough to attend, but not important enough to draw attention. Her plan was simple: make an appearance to establish her presence, then disappear during the fireworks display. By morning she would be miles away, ready to begin her new life as Meredith Gale, an orphaned girl seeking honest work. The ballroom glittered with hundreds of candles, the local gentry and nobility twirling across the polished floor. Thalia kept to the periphery, nodding politely when addressed but avoiding conversation. Just 1 hour, she reminded herself, counting the minutes until her escape. "You seem determined to avoid the dancing, miss." The deep voice startled her. Turning, Thalia found herself facing a tall man with sharp features, softened only by remarkable grey eyes. She recognized him instantly from her father's social circles, the reclusive Count Evander Blackthorn, rumoured to be as brilliant as he was forbidding. "Gale," she replied, dropping into a curtsy. "Meredith Gale, and I find observing more educational than participating, my lord." His eyebrow arched. "What education do you seek tonight, Miss Gale?" "How easily people wear masks," she said before she could stop herself. "How society values appearance above substance." Something flickered in his expression. Surprise, perhaps, or recognition of a kindred spirit. "Uncommon observations for a ball. I am not a common guest." For a moment his gaze seemed to pierce through her disguise, and Thalia felt herself holding her breath. Then the corner of his mouth lifted slightly. "No," he said quietly, "I don't believe you are." The orchestra began a new set, and he offered his hand. "Would you honor me with this dance, Miss Gale?" Dancing with the Count would draw attention she couldn't afford, yet refusing would seem suspicious. As their hands touched, Thalia felt an unexpected jolt, like lightning beneath her skin. "One dance," she agreed, "and then I must rejoin my companions." As he led her onto the floor, Thalia had no way of knowing that the manor where she planned to hide belonged to this very man, or that the intensity in his eyes came from immediate recognition of the Baron's supposedly obedient daughter. She also couldn't know that Count Blackthorn never forgot a face, and that her attempt at disguise had only piqued his interest in the mystery of why Lady Thalia Windermere would attend a country ball incognito on the eve of her betrothal announcement. The dance began, and with it a dangerous game neither was prepared to play. "The Eastern Wing requires attention before the Count returns, Meredith. You'll find everything you need in the supply closet." Thalia nodded at Mrs. Martha Holloway, the stern-faced housekeeper of Blackthorn Manor. 3 days had passed since her escape from Ashcroft Hall, and each hour brought fresh anxiety that her deception would be discovered. "Yes, Mrs. Holloway," she replied, keeping her eyes lowered as she'd observed the other maids doing. Her hands, once soft and manicured, now bore the redness of harsh soaps and scrubbing brushes. The transformation into Meredith Gale was more difficult than she had anticipated. "And do something about that posture," the housekeeper added. "You stand like you're waiting for someone to announce you at court." Thalia immediately hunched her shoulders, cursing herself for such a basic mistake. The nobility were recognized as much by their bearing as their clothing, a fact she must remember if she hoped to maintain her disguise. In the supply closet, she gathered dusting cloths and polish, mentally rehearsing the tasks Mrs. Holloway had demonstrated. The eastern wing housed the Count's private library and study, rooms she had been specifically instructed not to enter unless directed. The manor buzzed with activity. Count Blackthorne was returning from London that afternoon, and the staff worked frantically to ensure everything was perfect. Thalia had overheard whispers about the master's exacting standards and unpredictable temper. "He'll notice if a single book is out of place," warned Alice, an older maid who had taken pity on Thalia. "And heaven help you if you disturb his papers." Thalia's stomach tightened as she remembered the Count's penetrating gaze at the Madingley ball. Had he recognized her? The thought had plagued her since learning whose household she had joined. Of all the estates in the county, fate had led her to the home of the one man who had spoken with her on the night of her disappearance. A commotion at the front entrance scattered her thoughts. Male voices echoed through the corridor, followed by the distinct sound of Mrs. Holloway's greeting. "Welcome home, my lord. I trust your journey was satisfactory." "As satisfactory as any business in London can be, Mrs. Holloway." Thalia froze. That voice, deep and commanding, belonged to Count Blackthorne. She pressed herself against the wall of the corridor, hoping to remain unnoticed until he passed. Footsteps approached, and she lowered her head, clutching her cleaning supplies like a shield. "Ah!" A new face. The Count stopped directly before her. Thalia cursed her fair complexion as heat flooded her cheeks. She dropped into a curtsy, keeping her eyes fixed on his polished boots. "Yes, my lord, Meredith Gale, sir, recently employed." "Look at me, Miss Gale." The command left no room for refusal. Slowly, Thalia raised her gaze, meeting eyes the color of storm clouds. Recognition flickered there, she was certain of it, yet his expression revealed nothing. "You're assigned to the Eastern Wing?" he asked, nodding toward her supplies. "Yes, my lord. Come with me." To Thalia's horror, he turned and strode toward his private study, clearly expecting her to follow. Mrs. Holloway shot her a sharp glance that clearly communicated, "Don't disappoint him." The Count's study was a sanctuary of leather and mahogany, lined with books and dominated by a massive desk facing tall windows that overlooked the estate's gardens. He moved behind the desk and gestured toward a section of bookshelves. "These require attention. They've been neglected during my absence." Thalia approached the shelves cautiously. Many of the volumes were rare first editions, worth more than she could imagine. She selected a cloth and began gently removing a leather-bound tome. "You handle books with unusual care," he observed. "Most servants treat them as mere objects to be dusted." She stiffened. "Books deserve respect, my lord." "Indeed." He sat, watching her with unsettling intensity. "Tell me, Miss Gale, what brings you to Blackthorne Manor?" Mrs. Holloway mentioned a reference from her cousin, but little else. Thalia recited the story she had practiced with Eliza. "My parents died of fever last winter, my lord. I've been seeking respectable employment since." "How unfortunate." He opened a folder on his desk, seemingly losing interest. "You may continue." For nearly an hour, Thalia worked in silence, acutely aware of his presence. Occasionally, she felt his gaze upon her, but whenever she glanced his way, he appeared absorbed in his papers. As she reached for a book on a higher shelf, her sleeve caught on a decorative bronze eagle, sending it crashing to the floor. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the quiet room. "I beg your pardon, my lord," she gasped, dropping to her knees to retrieve the fallen object. The Count moved swiftly around the desk, kneeling beside her. His hand closed over hers as they both reached for the eagle, and Thalia felt that same inexplicable jolt she had experienced during their dance. "Are you aware," he said softly, "that the Windermere estate has offered a substantial reward for information regarding their missing daughter?" Thalia's blood turned to ice. "No, my lord, I've had little time for news." His eyes held hers, searching. "Curious timing, wouldn't you agree? The daughter vanishes the night before her betrothal announcement, and the next day a new maid appears at my door. Perhaps she fled an unwanted marriage," Thalia whispered, her voice barely audible. "Perhaps." He studied her face for another moment before rising and returning to his desk. "You may go, Miss Gale. Send Alice to finish the shelves." Thalia hurried from the room, her heart pounding against her ribs. He knew. Count Blackthorne recognized her, yet he hadn't exposed her. The question that would haunt her through the sleepless night ahead was simple. Why? What she couldn't see was how the Count watched her retreat, a faint smile playing at his lips as he penned a note to his solicitor in London. A man tasked with discovering exactly why Baron Windermere would sell his only daughter to a man like the Duke of Brentwood. Rain lashed against the windows of Blackthorne Manor as Thalia hurried through the servants' corridor with fresh linens. A week had passed since her encounter with the Count in his study, and she'd been reassigned to general household duties, far from his private quarters. Whether this was mercy or strategy, she couldn't determine. "Meredith," Mrs. Holloway's voice stopped her mid-stride. "The Count requires tea in the library. Alice is tending to Lady Philomena's rooms." Thalia's grip tightened on the linens. "Yes, Mrs. Holloway." "And girl," the housekeeper added, her expression softening slightly. "He's in one of his moods. Mind you don't speak unless spoken to." In the kitchen, Thalia prepared the tea tray with practiced movements that would have shocked her former self. Baron Windermere's daughter now knew how to brew a proper pot of Darjeeling and arrange biscuits on fine china without fingerprints. The library doors were ajar when she arrived. Thalia knocked softly before entering, finding the vast room empty save for the Count, who stood by the windows watching the storm. Lightning briefly illuminated his profile, sharp jaw clenched, brow furrowed. "Your tea, my lord," she announced, setting the tray on a side table. He turned, and Thalia noticed the newspaper clutched in his hand. "Have you seen the morning paper, Miss Gale?" "No, my lord. Servants rarely have time for reading." "A pity." He crossed to where she stood and thrust the paper toward her. "Perhaps you'll find this article of interest." Thalia's heart stuttered as she saw the headline, "Windermere heiress still missing. Duke offers additional reward." "Is that not remarkable dedication from a prospective husband?" the Count asked, his tone deceptively casual. "Most men would simply seek another bride, yet the Duke of Brentwood seems determined to claim what he considers rightfully his." Thalia struggled to keep her voice steady. "Perhaps he truly loves her, my lord. The Duke loves nothing but power and acquisition." Blackthorne's voice hardened. "A man who purchases a bride like a prized mare is incapable of love." Before she could respond, the library doors swung open as a slender boy of about 12 burst in, soaked to the skin and breathing heavily. "Master Timothy," Thalia exclaimed, forgetting her place. "You're drenched." The Count's eyebrows rose at her familiarity with his ward, but the boy grinned, water dripping from his sandy hair. "Miss Meredith scolds as fiercely as Mrs. Holloway," he said to the Count, "but she sneaks me extra pudding when no one's looking." "Does she indeed?" Blackthorne's expression remained neutral, but something like amusement flickered in his eyes. "What brings you charging in like a stampeding horse, Timothy?" "Dr. Fletcher sent me to fetch you, sir. The fever's broken at the orphanage. All the children are recovering." Thalia couldn't suppress her gasp of relief. For the past fortnight, the Count's ward had spoken of nothing but the outbreak of scarlet fever at the local orphanage. What she hadn't known was Blackthorne's involvement. "Excellent news," the Count nodded briskly. "Tell Simmons to ready the carriage. I'll bring additional supplies." As Timothy dashed away, leaving puddles in his wake, Thalia found herself alone again with Blackthorne. "You support the orphanage, my lord?" she asked before she could stop herself. "Does that surprise you, Miss Gale?" He crossed to a cabinet and unlocked it, removing several small parcels. "That the cold, mysterious Count might concern himself with orphaned children?" Heat rushed to her cheeks. "Forgive me. I didn't mean—" "No need for apologies. I'm well aware of my reputation." He paused, studying her. Timothy was an orphan from that same institution. His parents were respected scholars who died in a carriage accident when he was 4. Intelligence shouldn't be wasted due to circumstances of birth. That's uncommonly kind. Kindness has nothing to do with it. It's simple justice. He collected his packages and moved toward the door, then stopped. "You're welcome to accompany us if you wish." "Several of the children have been asking after the pretty new maid Timothy mentioned." Thalia hesitated only briefly before nodding. "I'd be honored, my lord." The orphanage stood on the outskirts of the village, a sturdy stone building surrounded by bare-limbed trees. Inside, Thalia was struck by the unexpected warmth and cleanliness of the place. Children's drawings decorated the walls, and though the furnishings were modest, everything appeared well-maintained. Count Blackthorne moved through the halls with familiar ease, greeted enthusiastically by children and staff alike. This was not the behavior of a benefactor making a rare appearance, but of a regular visitor who knew each child by name. "Sarah has been asking for you, my lord," the matron said, leading them to a small dormitory where a girl of about 8 sat propped against pillows. "Count Evander," the child called weakly, her face lighting up. To Thalia's astonishment, Blackthorn sat on the edge of the bed and took the girl's hand. "I hear you've been causing trouble, Miss Sarah." "Only a little," she giggled, then noticed Thalia. "Who's that?" "This is Miss Meredith. She works at my house." Sarah beckoned Thalia closer. "Are you the lady Timothy says the Count stares at when he thinks no one's looking?" "Sarah!" Timothy protested from the doorway, his face flaming red. Thalia felt her own cheeks burn as she glanced at Blackthorn, who appeared uncharacteristically discomposed. "I believe," he said with forced calm, "that young Timothy's imagination exceeds his observation skills." But later, as they rode back to the manor in silence, Thalia caught the Count watching her reflection in the carriage window. When their eyes met in the glass, neither looked away. That night, Thalia sat on her narrow bed in the servants' quarters, the newspaper article spread before her. The Duke of Brentwood had doubled the reward for information about her whereabouts. Her father was quoted describing her as confused and vulnerable, claiming she'd been influenced by radical ideas unsuitable for a lady of her station. What the article didn't explain was why a man like the Duke, wealthy, titled and powerful, would pursue her so relentlessly, and why Count Blackthorn, who clearly knew her identity, continued to protect her secret. As she folded the paper, a small object fell from between its pages, a delicate silver key attached to a note written in elegant script. "East Wing, 3rd bookcase from the window. If you wish to understand the Duke's interest in your family, start there. Destroy this note." Thalia stared at the key, torn between fear and an overwhelming need for answers. The Count was offering knowledge, but at what price? Midnight cast long shadows across the eastern wing as Thalia slipped through the darkened corridors of Blackthorn Manor. The silver key felt impossibly heavy in her palm. Twice she had nearly convinced herself to ignore the Count's mysterious invitation, yet curiosity, or perhaps something deeper, drove her forward. The library stood silent and imposing, moonlight filtering through tall windows to illuminate rows of leather-bound volumes. Thalia counted 3 bookcases from the window and ran her fingers along the polished wood, searching for a keyhole. Her hand brushed against a small brass plate camouflaged as decorative inlay. The key fit perfectly, turning with a soft click. A section of shelving swung outward, revealing a hidden compartment containing a single leather portfolio. Thalia's hands trembled as she removed it, carrying it to the reading table where a single candle had been left burning. Inside were documents bearing the seals of both the Duke of Brentwood and her father. She scanned the pages, her confusion growing with each paragraph. "Land deeds, mining rights, promissory notes," she whispered, struggling to make sense of the legal terminology. "Your father discovered silver on the northern boundaries of Ashcroft lands 3 years ago," Thalia gasped, nearly dropping the documents as Count Blackthorn emerged from the shadows of the adjoining study. "How long have you been there?" she demanded, forgetting her station in her alarm. "Long enough?" He approached, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "You should know I had no intention of frightening you, Lady Windermere." The use of her true name hung between them, ending all pretense. "How long have you known?" she asked quietly. "Since the moment we danced at Merdingley." He gestured toward the documents. "I recognized you instantly. Your father has displayed your portrait prominently at every social gathering for years, hoping to attract suitable matches." Thalia felt strangely numb, yet you said nothing. Why? The daughter of a baron doesn't disguise herself as a chambermaid without compelling reason. He took a seat across from her. "I wanted to understand before acting. And now, you understand?" She indicated the portfolio. "Partially. The Duke covets your father's silver mines. The Baron needs funds to maintain appearances after years of gambling losses. A marriage would transfer control of the mines to Brentwood through you." Thalia's mind raced. "But as a wife, I would have no legal claim, unless specific provisions were written into the marriage contract, which they were." Blackthorn slid a document toward her. "Your father may be a gambling fool, but he's not entirely without cunning. He structured the agreement to guarantee your future security. By selling me to a man 3 times my age," bitterness edged her voice, "a transaction that benefits everyone except you." His eyes held something akin to sympathy. "The question remains, what do you intend to do now?" Before she could answer, the library door opened abruptly. Timothy stood in the entrance, his expression urgent. "Sir, riders approaching. They bear the Duke of Brentwood's crest." Thalia felt the blood drain from her face. Blackthorn rose swiftly, his decision immediate. "Timothy, escort Miss Gale to Lady Philomena's chambers through the service passage. Explain the situation to my aunt." He turned to Thalia. "Lady Philomena arrived this evening while we were at dinner. She can be trusted. But the Duke will be dealt with. Go now." Timothy led her through a narrow corridor hidden behind a tapestry. Thalia's heart hammered as they ascended a servant's staircase to the upper floor, where the Count's elderly aunt maintained a permanent suite of rooms. Lady Philomena Thornfield proved to be a diminutive woman, with sharp eyes and silver hair arranged in an elegant coiffure. She assessed Thalia with one sweeping glance, as Timothy hastily explained the situation. "So you're the Baron's missing daughter," she declared once Timothy had been dismissed. "Come closer, child. Let me look at you properly." Thalia approached cautiously. The older woman circled her, nodding to herself. Evander mentioned a new maid, with unusual refinement. "I suspected something was amiss when he inquired about my blue silk gown from last season." She smiled shrewdly. "My nephew rarely takes interest in ladies' fashion. He asked about a gown?" Thalia's confusion was evident. "For the Harrington masquerade tomorrow evening. The Duke will be in attendance, and Evander thought it wise to have you present but disguised." She rang for her maid. "We must alter it immediately, if you're to accompany me as my companion." "Lady Philomena, I don't understand." "Call me Aunt Philly, dear, everyone does." The older woman patted her hand. "And understand this. My nephew has spent considerable resources investigating your situation. I've never seen him so determined." "But why would he help me? We're practically strangers." Lady Philomena's expression softened. "Evander's mother was forced into marriage with his father, a cruel man who valued her family connections and nothing else. She died when Evander was 12, her spirit broken by years of mistreatment." "I had no idea," Thalia whispered. "Few do. Evander guards his privacy zealously." She squeezed Thalia's hand. "Now, help me select appropriate accessories for tomorrow. If we're to fool the Duke, we must be convincing." The following evening found Thalia transformed. Lady Philomena's skilled maid had altered the blue silk gown to fit her perfectly. Her auburn hair was styled in an unfamiliar fashion, and a delicate silver mask concealed the upper portion of her face. "Remember," Lady Philomena instructed as their carriage approached Harrington House, "you are Miss Leonora Halewood, my American goddaughter visiting from Boston. Speak as little as possible and never directly to the Duke." The ballroom glittered with hundreds of candles, the county's elite swirling in a kaleidoscope of color and light. From behind her mask, Thalia observed the Duke of Brentwood holding court near the refreshment table, a corpulent man with cold eyes and jeweled fingers that reminded her of talons. "He's watching you." The low voice at her ear made her start. Count Blackthorn stood beside her, resplendent in formal attire, his own mask doing little to disguise his identity. "The Duke," she whispered, alarmed. "No." His gaze held hers. "I am." The orchestra began a waltz, and without asking he led her onto the dance floor. Unlike their first dance at Madingley, this time he held her with clear intent, his hand firm at her waist. "Your performance as a chambermaid was remarkably convincing," he said, as they moved through the steps, "though your knowledge of Shakespeare betrayed you when you quoted Hamlet while dusting my library." A reluctant smile tugged at her lips. "I didn't realize you were listening." "I find myself listening for you in every room I enter." The admission seemed to surprise even him. He looked away, then continued with forced lightness. "My aunt tells me you've agreed to her ridiculous scheme. It seems the safest option until we determine the Duke's next move. And your father's." His expression darkened. "Baron Windermere arrived this afternoon. He's here tonight." Thalia missed a step, her composure cracking. "Where?" The Count steadied her, drawing her closer than propriety allowed. "Stay calm, he's by the eastern entrance, speaking with Lord Hammond." As the dance ended, Blackthorn escorted her to a secluded alcove near the terrace doors. "Wait here. I'll fetch my aunt to accompany you back to our carriage." Alone, Thalia struggled to control her racing thoughts. She hadn't anticipated her father's presence. If he recognized her, everything would be lost. "Pardon me, miss, but have we met before?" The cultured voice froze her blood. "You seem oddly familiar." Thalia turned slowly to face her father's questioning gaze. "I don't believe we've been introduced, sir." Thalia lowered her voice to a husky whisper, praying her father wouldn't recognize it. "I am Miss Leonora Halewood, visiting from Boston." Baron Windermere squinted, his wine-flushed face inches from her mask. American, you say? You don't sound American. My mother was English, sir. I was educated in London. Thalia forced her lips into a smile, fighting the urge to flee. Curious. You remind me of someone. He swayed slightly, the effects of champagne evident in his unfocused gaze. My daughter, perhaps. Have you heard? She's disappeared. Ungrateful child. Pain lanced through Thalia's chest at his callous dismissal. Perhaps she had reason to leave, sir. The Baron's expression hardened. What would you know of it? She was to make an advantageous match, secure her future. Instead, she's disgraced her family name and left me to face the Duke's wrath alone. An unfortunate situation, came Lady Philomena's crisp voice as she appeared beside them. Come, Leonora dear, the night air has turned chilly. One moment. Baron Windermere caught Thalia's wrist as she turned to leave. Remove your mask, Miss Halewood. Humour an old man's curiosity. Thalia froze, trapped between exposure and refusal that would only heighten suspicion. Baron Windermere. Count Blackthorn's arrival sent visible relief through Lady Philomena. I believe Lord Brentwood was looking for you. Something about finalizing the terms of your agreement? The Baron released Thalia's wrist, instantly distracted. Yes, of course. Excuse me, ladies. As her father departed, Thalia sagged against her companion. He nearly recognized me. Into the garden, quickly, Lady Philomena directed. Evander, create a diversion if the Baron returns this way. The night air cooled Thalia's burning cheeks as Lady Philomena led her through manicured hedges to a small stone bench hidden from view of the ballroom. Remove your mask, child. You look faint. Thalia complied, drawing deep breaths to steady herself. He called me ungrateful, as though I owed him my life as payment for his gambling debts. Men like your father see daughters as assets to be traded. Lady Philomena's tone held ancient bitterness. My own father was no different. How did you escape? Thalia asked, suddenly curious about the elderly woman who had so readily become her ally. A sad smile crossed the lady's face. I didn't. I married Lord Thornfield at 17 and was widowed by 20. Fortune favoured me with a wealthy elderly husband who died before he could crush my spirit. She patted Thalia's hand. But we're creating a different path for you. Movement near the garden entrance caught their attention. Count Blackthorn approached, his expression grave. The carriage is waiting at the side gate, he announced. We must leave immediately. The Duke has announced his intention to search for Lady Thalia in the surrounding estates, beginning tomorrow. Beginning with Blackthorn Manor, no doubt, Lady Philomena concluded. Our ruse won't survive close scrutiny. Then I must leave, Thalia said, rising. I've imposed on your kindness long enough. Nonsense. Blackthorn's rejection was immediate. The Duke has men watching the roads. You won't make it 5 miles. What do you suggest, Evander? His aunt asked. Hampstead Lodge, my hunting property near the Scottish border. No one connects it to me directly as it's held in trust. He turned to Thalia. You'll travel with my aunt as her companion. I've already arranged the necessary documents. Thalia stared at him, overwhelmed by his thoroughness. Why are you doing this? Risking so much for someone you barely know? The Count's expression softened momentarily. Perhaps I recognize something of myself in your situation. A life controlled by others' ambitions. Lady Philomena coughed delicately. We should continue this conversation elsewhere. The Duke has stepped onto the terrace. The journey back to Blackthorn Manor passed in tense silence. Plans were made for an early departure the following morning, with Lady Philomena's carriage scheduled to leave before dawn. Unable to sleep, Thalia wandered to the library near midnight, drawn to the place where she had first learned the truth about her father's arrangement with the Duke. She found Count Blackthorn there, standing before the fire, a glass of brandy in his hand. You should be resting, he said without turning. Tomorrow's journey will be arduous. As should you. She moved to stand beside him, watching the flames dance. Yet here we both are. Indeed. He sipped his brandy, his profile limned in firelight. Sleeplessness has been my constant companion since meeting you, Lady Windermere. The formality of her title stung unexpectedly. Please call me Thalia. After all, you've seen me scrubbing floors. A faint smile touched his lips. Very well, Thalia. And I am Evander, at least in private. The use of his given name created an immediate intimacy that sent warmth spreading through her chest. They stood in companionable silence until he spoke again. I received word from my solicitor this evening. Your father's debts are more substantial than we realized. The Duke holds notes amounting to nearly half the value of Ashcroft Estate. How is that possible? Thalia asked, stunned. Father always claimed our lands were prosperous. They were until he began investing in speculative ventures 5 years ago. Each failure led to more desperate wagers. Evander's expression darkened. The silver discovery should have saved him, but he'd already borrowed heavily against it. Using me as collateral, she concluded bitterly. The Duke's interest in you is purely financial. With you as his wife, he gains control of the mines without the messy business of foreclosure. He hesitated. There's something else you should know. The contract includes a provision requiring an heir within 2 years of marriage. Thalia felt ill at the implication. He's a monster, a calculating one. Evander set down his glass and faced her directly. Thalia, there may be a way to invalidate the contract, but it requires proof of your father's mental incompetence when signing, or evidence of coercion. And how would we obtain such proof? I have connections in London investigating the Duke's business practices. If we find a pattern of similar arrangements, a commotion in the entrance hall interrupted him. Moments later, Timothy burst into the library, his nightshirt rumpled and his eyes wide. Sir, riders approaching, at least 6 men. Mrs. Holloway says they bear the Duke's crest. Evander's reaction was immediate. Wake Lady Philomena. The departure plans have changed. He turned to Thalia. There's a priest's hole behind the north study. Timothy will show you. Stay there until I come for you. But trust me, Thalia. His hand caught hers, squeezing briefly. I won't let him take you. The hidden chamber was small and musty, accessible only through a narrow passage concealed by paneling. Timothy provided a lantern and blanket before disappearing to assist with the unexpected visitors. Thalia huddled in the confined space, straining to hear voices from the main house. An hour passed, then another. Finally, the panel slid open, revealing Evander's grim face. They've gone for now, he said, helping her out. But the Duke himself was with them. He's convinced you're here. In the dim corridor, she could see a darkening bruise on his cheek. You're hurt. What happened? A disagreement regarding the proper treatment of staff. His smile was tight. The Duke suggested questioning the female servants using methods I found objectionable. Horror filled her. He would hurt innocent women to find me. He would. Evander's eyes held a cold fury. But listen carefully. Lady Philomena is leaving before first light, ostensibly to visit her sister in Bath. You will not be with her. But I thought, the Duke's men will follow her carriage. You and I will take a different route north, traveling as merchant cousins from York. The necessary clothing and papers are being prepared now. Thalia processed this change of plans, realizing what it meant. Just the 2 of us? People will talk. People always talk. His expression softened. But I give you my word as a gentleman. Your reputation will suffer no harm in my care. Looking into his earnest grey eyes, Thalia made her decision. When do we leave? Morning mist shrouded the countryside as Thalia and Evander departed through Blackthorn Manor's eastern gate. Dressed in modest merchant clothing, they rode in an unmarked carriage with trade goods visible through the windows, a convincing disguise arranged by Lady Philomena's quick thinking. We'll reach Northampton by nightfall, Evander said, consulting a small map. An associate of mine keeps rooms above his printing shop. We'll be safe there. Thalia nodded, adjusting the simple bonnet that concealed her distinctive auburn hair. 3 days had passed since their hurried escape, traveling along lesser-known roads and avoiding main coaching inns. So far, they had encountered no signs of pursuit. Will your aunt be safe? She asked, the question that had troubled her since their departure. Philomena is more cunning than the Duke anticipates. Once she reaches Bath, she'll make a very public appearance at the assembly rooms before quietly traveling north to meet us. A rare smile softened his features. She's quite looking forward to outwitting Brentwood's men. The carriage hit a rut, jostling them closer together. Thalia became acutely aware of Evander's proximity, the subtle scent of his shaving soap, the warmth radiating from his body. These days of close quarters had created an unexpected intimacy between them. You've been quiet this morning, he observed, his grey eyes studying her face. Are you unwell? Just thinking. She turned toward the window, unable to meet his gaze. About what happens after we reach Hampstead Lodge. I cannot impose on your protection indefinitely. You impose nothing. My assistance is freely given. But at what cost? Your reputation, your standing in society, are of little concern to me. He shifted to face her directly. Thalia, I made a choice to help you. I do not regret it. The conviction in his voice silenced her protests. They continued in companionable silence until reaching the outskirts of Northampton, where Evander directed the driver to a narrow street lined with shops. Above a modest printing establishment, They found clean, if simple, accommodations. My associate and his wife live in the adjoining house, Evander explained as they settled in. They'll bring dinner shortly. You should rest until then. Though exhaustion pulled at her limbs, Thalia found herself unable to sleep. The events of the past weeks played through her mind like scenes from a theatrical production. Her planned marriage to the Duke, her escape to Blackthorn Manor, the discovery of her father's financial entanglements. And now, most confusing of all, her growing feelings for a man she had initially considered merely a temporary ally. Evening brought a simple but hearty meal, delivered by the printer's wife, who regarded Thalia with poorly concealed curiosity. After they'd eaten, Evander produced a letter. "From my solicitor in London," he explained, breaking the seal. "Perhaps we'll finally have answers regarding the Duke's arrangement with your father." As he read, his expression darkened. "It seems Brentwood has employed similar tactics before. 3 other landowners with financial difficulties, 3 daughters compelled into marriage. Each property contained valuable resources, timber, coal, water rights. And the daughters?" Thalia asked quietly. Evander hesitated. 2 died within 5 years of their marriages. Childbed fever, officially. The 3rd lives in seclusion at the Duke's country estate, rumored to be of unstable mind. A chill ran through Thalia. "He would have killed me once he had legal claim to the mines." "I believe so." Evander set the letter aside. "This information alone won't invalidate the contract, but it establishes a pattern that might sway the right judge. If we can find one not in Brentwood's pocket." She rose and moved to the window, watching lamplighters illuminate the darkening street. "My father may be weak and foolish, but surely he wouldn't knowingly condemn me to such a fate. People see what they wish to see." Evander joined her at the window, his reflection appearing beside hers in the glass. "Your father saw financial salvation, not the man offering it." Their eyes met in the window's reflection. Something shifted in the air between them, the careful distance they had maintained, dissolving in the intimacy of shared danger and growing trust. "Thalia," he began, his voice low and uncertain, "I must tell you." A sharp knock interrupted them. The printer's apprentice stood at the door, breathless with urgency. "Begging your pardon, sir, but there are men asking after recent travelers. They're showing a sketch that looks much like the lady." Thalia's heart sank. "They've found us." "Not yet," Evander replied, already gathering their belongings. "We'll use the rear exit. The carriage is ready?" "Yes, sir, as you instructed this morning." "Your foresight continues to amaze me," Thalia said as they hurried down the back stairs. "Not foresight, experience." His hand closed protectively around hers. "I've spent my life preparing for the worst, while hoping for better." They slipped into the waiting carriage, which immediately set off toward the northern road. Evander remained vigilant, watching for signs of pursuit through the small rear window. "We'll avoid the main road," he decided after several miles. "There's a coaching inn near Kettering where we can change horses and continue through the night." The Stag and Crown Inn bustled with activity despite the late hour. While Evander arranged for fresh horses, Thalia waited in a private parlour, her nerves stretched thin by their narrow escape. Through the partially open door, she could hear fragments of conversation from the main taproom, local gossip, farming complaints, and then, alarmingly, mention of the Duke of Brentwood. She edged closer to the door, straining to listen. "Offering £500 for information," a gruff voice was saying. "That's more than most see in a lifetime." "What's the girl done to warrant such a sum?" asked another. "Broke a marriage contract, they say. High treason among the quality." Laughter followed. "Though if she's half as pretty as the sketch, I'd hide her myself for less." Thalia retreated from the door, her hands trembling. £500 would tempt even the most honourable citizen. Their disguises suddenly seemed flimsy protection against such determined pursuit. The parlour door opened, and she startled visibly. "The horses will be ready in 20 minutes, Evander announced, then frowned at her expression. "What's happened?" She relayed what she'd overheard. His face remained impassive, but she noted the tightening of his jaw. "Money speaks loudly," he acknowledged, "but we have an advantage. Brentwood doesn't know our destination." A commotion in the courtyard drew their attention. Through the window they could see several riders arriving, men wearing the Duke's livery. "The rear door," Evander directed, taking her elbow. "Quickly!" They slipped into a narrow corridor leading to the kitchens. As they passed an alcove housing a service stairwell, voices approached from ahead. Evander pulled Thalia into the alcove, pressing her against the wall as footsteps passed by. His body shielded hers, their faces inches apart in the dim light. For a breathless moment, Thalia was acutely aware of nothing but his proximity, his hand still holding her arm, his eyes searching hers with an intensity that made her heart race for reasons entirely unrelated to their danger. "Evander," she whispered, unable to look away. He leaned closer, hesitated, then pressed his lips to hers in a kiss both gentle and urgent. Thalia responded instinctively, her hands moving to his shoulders as months of tension dissolved into unexpected sweetness. When they separated, Evander touched her cheek with uncharacteristic tenderness. "I should have done that days ago." "Why didn't you?" she asked, still breathless. "1,000 reasons. None of them matter now." He glanced down the corridor. "We need to keep moving." They made their way through the kitchen and into the stable yard, where Evander's quick thinking and a handful of coins secured them 2 horses. As they rode north under a canopy of stars, Thalia's mind whirled with the evening's developments, the kiss, the pursuit, and the growing certainty that her feelings for Count Blackthorn had progressed far beyond gratitude. They stopped to rest near dawn, finding shelter in an abandoned gamekeeper's cottage. As Evander built a small fire, Thalia gathered her courage. "About what happened at the inn, I apologize if I overstepped," he said stiffly, not meeting her eyes. "You didn't." She moved to kneel beside him. "I only wondered what it meant." The fire caught, illuminating his troubled expression. "It meant that I care for you far more than is wise for either of us." Before she could respond, hoofbeats approached outside. Evander extinguished the fire with a swift movement and drew his pistol. "Stay here," he whispered, moving toward the window. Through a gap in the shutters, they could see a carriage on the nearby road. Not the Duke's men, but a farmer and his wife heading to market. As the danger passed, Evander relaxed his stance. "We should continue. There's a village 3 miles north where we can purchase supplies." "Evander." Thalia caught his arm. "We need to finish our conversation. This isn't the time for personal matters," he said, though his eyes betrayed his words. "When is the time? Between one danger and the next." Her frustration spilled over. "I deserve to know if that kiss was merely impulse or something more." "Something more," his admission came reluctantly. "Far more than I intended when I first offered my help." Joy surged through her, but before she could respond, his expression hardened. "But my feelings change nothing. You're still in danger and I've sworn to protect you. That must remain our priority." As they continued their journey, a new tension settled between them. Unspoken feelings competing with practical concerns. By midday, they reached the village of Grafton Underwood, where Evander purchased supplies while Thalia waited in the churchyard, hidden by her plain clothing and bonnet. She wandered among the gravestones, contemplating the strange path that had led her here, from pampered baron's daughter to fugitive, from arranged marriage to unexpected love. For despite all caution, she could no longer deny that her feelings for Evander had deepened into something she had never anticipated. A conversation from a nearby bench caught her attention. 2 gentlemen engaged in animated discussion. "Blackthorn stands to gain considerably if the Windermere girl isn't found," one was saying. "Those northern lands border his hunting property. He's been trying to acquire them for years." "You think he's hiding her himself?" the other asked skeptically. "It would be a clever strategy. Help the girl escape, gain her trust, then use her to secure the land rights once the Duke's claim is invalidated." Thalia froze, their words hitting her like physical blows. Could it be true? Had Evander's assistance been motivated not by compassion, but by calculated self-interest? As the men continued speculating, doubt crept through her like poison. Every interaction with Evander took on new, suspicious meaning. His knowledge of her father's finances, his convenient appearance at the Madingley ball, even his kiss at the inn. When he returned to the churchyard, she struggled to maintain her composure. They rode in silence until reaching a small inn where they secured separate rooms for the night. Alone at last, Thalia gave in to the tears she had been fighting all afternoon. By morning, her sadness had hardened into resolve. Before continuing their journey, she would confront Evander with what she had overheard. His response would determine whether the fragile trust between them survived and whether her heart would break beyond repair. Dark clouds gathered on the horizon as Thalia paced the small room above the village inn. Each creak of the floorboards matched the thundering of her heart. The conversation she'd overheard in the churchyard played relentlessly in her mind, poisoning every memory of Evander's kindness with suspicion. A knock at her door startled her from her thoughts. "We should depart within the hour," Evander said when she opened it. "A storm is approaching, and I'd prefer to reach Lenora Quentsworth's cottage before it breaks." Thalia studied his face, searching for signs of deception. Lenora Quentsworth, you've never mentioned her before. My mother's former lady's maid. She lives in a cottage near Hampstead Lodge. His expression revealed nothing beyond practical concern. Is something troubling you? The question broke her fragile composure. Is it true that my father's northern lands border your hunting property? Surprise flickered across his features before his expression closed. Yes, though I fail to see the relevance. And have you been trying to acquire those lands for years? Understanding dawned in his eyes, followed by a coldness she had never witnessed. I see. You've heard rumors and immediately assumed the worst. Is it true? She pressed, her voice rising despite her efforts to remain calm. Yes, I've attempted to purchase portions of the Windermere Northern Estate. The land contains valuable water rights that would benefit local farmers who lease from me. His jaw tightened. Is that the extent of what you've heard? Or shall I address other accusations? They said you're hiding me to gain control of the lands once the Duke's claim is invalidated. The words tasted bitter on her tongue. That you're using me. For a moment, he appeared genuinely stunned. Then anger hardened his features. After everything we've endured together, you believe I orchestrated this entire situation for property rights. I don't know what to believe anymore. Tears threatened, but she fought them back. Perhaps you saw an opportunity when I appeared at your door and seized it. An opportunity. The words fell like ice between them. Is that what you think our kiss represented? A calculated move in some grand strategy? When she couldn't answer, he continued, his voice dangerously quiet. My solicitor can provide documentation showing I gave up pursuing those lands 2 years ago when your father began his disastrous investments. I determined then that association with Windermere Holdings might prove financially ruinous. Shame washed over her as his logic dismantled the fragile structure of her suspicions. Evander, we're losing daylight. He turned away, his posture rigid. I'll await you downstairs. The journey to Lenora's cottage passed in painful silence, broken only by directions and necessary warnings as the weather deteriorated. Rain began to fall in heavy sheets, matching Thalia's gloomy spirits. By the time they reached the small stone dwelling nestled against a hillside, both were drenched and chilled to the bone. Lenora Quentsworth proved to be a sturdy woman in her 60s with bright eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. She welcomed them with hot tea and dry clothing, asking no questions beyond what Evander volunteered. You'll stay until the storm passes, she declared, brooking no argument. The Duke's men won't find you here. Few even know this cottage exists. As Thalia changed into borrowed garments, she could hear Evander's low voice conferring with Lenora in the main room. The occasional mention of Baron and contract suggested they were discussing her father's arrangement with the Duke. By evening, the storm had intensified into a howling gale that rattled the cottage windows. Evander had retreated to the small stable to tend the horses, leaving Thalia alone with their hostess. He's a good man, Lenora said abruptly as she stirred the hearth fire. Better than most who carry a title. Thalia looked up from the mending she'd been pretending to do. You've known him long? Since he was born. I was lady's maid to his mother, the Countess. Lenora's expression softened with memory. I held him the day he entered this world, and I held him the day his mother left it. Lady Philomena mentioned his mother was unhappy in her marriage. Unhappy? Lenora snorted. That's a gentle word for what she endured. The old Count was a cruel man who saw her as property, nothing more. When she died, Evander was 12, old enough to understand, young enough to be powerless. Guilt tightened Thalia's chest as she realized how deeply her accusations must have cut. I misjudged him today. Easy enough to do. He guards himself carefully. Lenora gave her a shrewd look. But not, I think, from you. Not anymore. Before Thalia could respond, the cottage door burst open. Evander staggered in, blood streaming from a gash on his temple. Duke's men, he gasped, as both women rushed to his side. 6 riders. They've found us. Lenora sprang into action, barring the door and extinguishing lamps. The priest's tunnel, quickly. She moved a threadbare rug, revealing a trapdoor. This passage leads to the old chapel ruins. From there, take the east path to Hampstead Lodge. My brother is caretaker there. He'll hide you until this passes. Come with us, Thalia urged, helping Evander toward the opening. And lead them straight to you? I think not. Lenora pressed a small pistol into Thalia's hands. I'll claim solitary residence. Go now. The tunnel was low and narrow, forcing them to crouch as they navigated by touch more than sight. Evander leaned heavily against Thalia, his breathing labored. "What happened?" she whispered. "Ambush near the stable," he replied, his voice tight with pain. "I recognized the Duke's crest too late." They emerged among crumbling stone walls, the remains of a medieval chapel half reclaimed by forest. Rain lashed at them as they stumbled toward the eastern path, now a muddy torrent in the downpour. "We can't make it to the lodge in this," Thalia shouted over the storm. "You're injured, and the path is washing away." Evander pointed toward a dense thicket. "Hunter's shelter, just beyond those trees." The small structure was little more than a lean-to with partial walls, but it offered some protection from the driving rain. Thalia helped Evander inside, alarmed by his pallor in the brief illumination of lightning. "Let me see your wound." She tore a strip from her borrowed petticoat to clean away the blood. The gash was deep, but had begun to clot. "What else?" "You're favoring your left side." "Ribs," he admitted. "One of them caught me with a pistol butt." "Why didn't they shoot you?" she asked, helping him remove his sodden coat to examine his torso. "They need me alive." "The Duke wants to know where you're hidden." He winced as her fingers probed his ribcage. "Nothing broken, I think, just bruised." As she worked, binding his ribs with more strips of petticoat, Thalia gathered her courage. "I'm sorry for doubting you." His eyes, grey as the storm clouds, met hers. "You had reason. Our world teaches women to be suspicious of male assistance. It often comes with hidden price tags. Not yours." She finished the binding and sat back. "I should have trusted what I've seen of your character, rather than the words of strangers." Lightning illuminated the shelter, followed immediately by deafening thunder. Through the deluge, they heard shouts and the distant whinny of horses. "They're searching the woods," Evander said, struggling to stand. "We can't stay here." "You can barely walk," Thalia protested. "I don't intend to walk." He pulled aside a rotting floorboard, revealing a small cache of supplies. From it, he extracted a tin of gunpowder and flint. "I intend to create a diversion." Understanding his plan, Thalia shook her head. "It's too dangerous in this storm. The entire forest could ignite." "Not with this rain." He pressed the pistol Lenora had given them into her hands. "Take the western path to the stone circle. Wait for me there." "We stay together," she insisted, the earlier rift between them forgotten in the face of immediate danger. "Thalia." His hand cupped her cheek, his expression softening despite the urgency. "Trust me one more time." Before she could argue further, he kissed her, brief but fierce, and pushed her toward the western opening of the shelter. "Go, now." Heart pounding, she obeyed, ducking into the storm and racing along the narrow path. Behind her, she heard Evander moving in the opposite direction, deliberately making noise to draw their pursuers away from her. The path rose steeply, leading to a circle of ancient standing stones that crowned the hillside. Gasping for breath, Thalia crouched behind the largest monolith, scanning the forest below for signs of pursuit. A sharp crack split the air, followed by shouting. Flames erupted briefly near the chapel ruins, quickly doused by rain but creating enough light and confusion to disorient the searchers. Through the chaos, she spotted Evander's tall figure sprinting toward the hill. Relief flooded her, immediately replaced by horror as a mounted figure emerged from the trees behind him. The Duke of Brentwood himself, unmistakable even in the dim light, raised a pistol. Without thinking, Thalia stood and fired Lenora's weapon. The shot went wide but startled the Duke's horse, which reared violently. By the time he regained control, Evander had reached the stone circle. "Are you mad?" he demanded, pulling her back into the shelter of the stones. "You could have been seen." "He was going to shoot you," she replied, shaking from the aftermath of fear and determination. Evander's anger dissolved. He pulled her against him, uncaring of his injured ribs. Brave, foolish woman. For a moment, they clung to each other, the storm raging around them forgotten. Then practical concerns reasserted themselves. "The lodge is half a mile north," he said, releasing her reluctantly. "If we can reach it before they regroup." They moved carefully through the storm, using the standing stones for cover until they reached the northern path. The terrain grew steeper, slowing their progress as mud sucked at their boots and low branches whipped their faces. Thalia's foot slipped on a slick rock, sending her tumbling down a short embankment. Pain lanced through her ankle as she tried to stand. "I think it's sprained," she gasped as Evander reached her side. Without hesitation, he lifted her into his arms, ignoring his own injuries. "Hold on to me." "You can't carry me all the way to the lodge," she protested. "Not with your ribs." "Watch me." His determination brooked no argument. They had traveled perhaps a quarter mile when torchlight appeared behind them on the path. The Duke's men had picked up their trail. "Leave me," Thalia urged. "I'll hide while you get help." "No." Evander's voice was resolute as he increased his pace despite obvious pain. "I will not lose you to him." The words, simple yet profound, silenced her protests. Through the curtain of rain, lights appeared ahead, the windows of Hampstead Lodge glowing like beacons in the darkness. They were still 100 yards from safety when a shout confirmed their worst fears. They had been spotted. "Run!" Thalia whispered, pushing against Evander's chest. "Please." Instead, he set her down carefully against a tree trunk and turned to face their pursuers, positioning himself between Thalia and danger. Through the rain, they could make out 3 figures approaching, the Duke's unmistakable bulk in the lead. "How touching," Brentwood called, his voice carrying over the storm. "The Count playing hero for a runaway bride." "She was never your bride, Brentwood," Evander replied, his hand moving subtly toward his boot where Thalia knew he kept a small dagger. "The contract says otherwise." The Duke advanced, pistol raised. "Step aside, Blackthorn. This need not involve you further. It involved me the moment you threatened an innocent woman." "Innocent?" Brentwood laughed harshly. "She's cost me a fortune in pursuit. I intend to recoup my investment." As the Duke took another step forward, a shot rang out, startling them all. The bullet struck the ground near Brentwood's feet. "That was a warning," called a firm voice from the direction of the lodge. "The next one won't be." Lenora's brother, the caretaker, stood on the path with several armed men, tenants from the neighboring farms, Thalia realized. Help had arrived just in time. Outnumbered and outmaneuvered, the Duke hesitated. "This isn't finished, Blackthorn. The girl is legally bound to me." "A contract obtained through coercion is no contract at all," Evander replied steadily. "Leave my lands, or I'll have you arrested for trespassing and attempted murder." For a tense moment, it seemed the Duke might challenge the order. Then, with a final venomous glare, he signaled his men to retreat. As their pursuers disappeared into the storm, Evander sagged against the tree, his strength finally giving way. Thalia caught him, supporting his weight despite her injured ankle. "Hold on," she whispered against his rain-soaked hair. "We're almost safe." Together, they limped the final distance to Hampstead Lodge, where Lenora's brother and the local physician awaited. As they crossed the threshold into warmth and security, Thalia felt something shift within her, fear giving way to certainty, doubt to trust. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Morning light filtered through leaded glass windows, casting diamond patterns across the bedchamber floor. Thalia sat in a chair beside the bed where Evander lay, his breathing finally steady after a night of feverish delirium. The physician had stitched his head wound and bound his ribs, expressing cautious optimism that no lasting damage had been done. "You should rest," came Lady Philomena's voice from the doorway. She had arrived at Hampstead Lodge shortly after dawn, having been alerted by Lenora's swift messenger. "You've barely left his side in 2 days." "I can't leave him," Thalia replied, her fingers entwined with Evander's. "Not after what he endured for my sake." The elderly woman approached, laying a gentle hand on Thalia's shoulder. "He's stronger than he appears. Blackthorns have survived worse." "The Duke won't stop," Thalia said, voicing the fear that had plagued her throughout her vigil. "Even if Evander recovers fully, Brentwood will find another way to claim what he believes is his." "Perhaps." Lady Philomena's expression turned shrewd. "But circumstances have changed since you fled Ashcroft Hall." She extended a folded newspaper. The headline made Thalia's breath catch. "Duke of Brentwood under investigation. Allegations of fraud and coercion." "Evander's solicitor has been quite industrious," Lady Philomena explained. 3 former business associates of the Duke have come forward with evidence of similar predatory arrangements. The magistrate issued search warrants for Brentwood's London offices yesterday. Hope, fragile but persistent, bloomed in Thalia's chest. "Will it be enough? Combined with your testimony and the documentation we've gathered regarding your father's contract, yes." She paused, her expression softening. "There's something else you should know. Your father arrived in the village this morning." Thalia stiffened. "Why?" "To see you," he claims. "Evander's man in London located him 3 days ago and revealed the true nature of the Duke's intentions toward you." Lady Philomena's mouth thinned disapprovingly. "The Baron appears genuinely shocked by what nearly befell his daughter." "Or shocked that his profitable arrangement has been disrupted," Thalia replied bitterly. A faint pressure against her fingers interrupted the conversation. Evander's eyes had opened, alert despite his weakened state. "Don't judge too harshly until you've heard him out," he said, his voice raspy from disuse. "Your father may be a fool, but I don't believe he knowingly endangered you." Thalia's heart leapt at his recovery, but uncertainty clouded her joy. "You defend him, after all he's done?" "I defend your right to the truth before making permanent judgments." He attempted to sit up, wincing at the movement. "Family, however flawed, remains family." Lady Philomena nodded approvingly. "Well said, nephew. Now, shall I send for some broth, or would you prefer to continue looking nobly tragic for another hour?" A ghost of a smile touched Evander's lips. "Broth would be welcome, Aunt, and perhaps you might arrange a meeting between Lady Windermere and her father, in the blue parlour, where I can easily join them if needed." After his aunt departed, Thalia helped Evander drink water from a bedside glass. "You shouldn't concern yourself with my family troubles. You need to recover. Your troubles became mine the moment you entered my household in disguise." His hand covered hers. "Do you regret it, coming to Blackthorn Manor?" "Never," she answered without hesitation. "It led me to you." Something vulnerable flickered in his eyes, a rare glimpse beneath the composed exterior he presented to the world. "Despite the danger, the uncertainty, because of who you've proven to be through danger and uncertainty," she leaned forward, pressing her lips gently to his. "A man worth loving." The admission hung between them, neither withdrawn nor explicitly acknowledged. Evander's fingers brushed her cheek, a gesture more intimate than words. "Rest now," she whispered. "I'll return after speaking with my father." Baron Windermere paced the blue parlour when Thalia entered, his normally florid face pale and drawn. He appeared to have aged years in the month since she'd fled. "Thalia," he breathed, taking an abortive step toward her before halting, uncertainty evident in his posture. "You look well." "No thanks to your arrangements, father." She remained by the door, unwilling to close the distance between them. The Baron flinched. "I never intended. That is to say, Brentwood gave assurances that you would be treated with respect and consideration, while he waited for me to produce an heir before disposing of me." She couldn't keep the bitterness from her voice. "Did you investigate any of his previous marriages? The convenient deaths of his young brides?" "No," he admitted, shame evident in his slumped shoulders. "I was desperate, blind to anything beyond solving our immediate financial crisis." "So desperate you would sacrifice your only child?" Tears welled in the Baron's eyes. "I genuinely believed I was securing your future, the Duke's wealth, his connections. I thought they would protect you from the hardships I faced." He sank into a chair, suddenly old and diminished. "I was a fool." Despite her resolve to remain unmoved, Thalia felt her anger softening at the genuine remorse in her father's manner. "Yes, you were. Count Blackthorn's solicitor showed me evidence of Brentwood's true character." He looked up, his expression haunted. "What I nearly condemned you to, I'll never forgive myself. You pursued me relentlessly after I fled, set rewards for my capture. Because I believed you had been misled by romantic notions," he replied, "that you would regret throwing away such an advantageous match. It never occurred to me you might have legitimate reasons for your actions." A heavy silence fell between them, years of misunderstanding and failed communication condensed into a single painful moment. "The contract," Thalia finally said. "Can it be voided?" "Already done." The Baron withdrew a document from his coat. "I signed the nullification this morning in the presence of a magistrate. You are free of both Brentwood and my poor judgment." She accepted the paper with trembling hands, scanning the legal text that formally released her from the marriage agreement. "What of the silver mines? The estate?" "We'll manage." A hint of his old pride returned. "The mines remain profitable, despite Brentwood's manipulations. With proper management and less gambling on my part, Ashcroft will recover. And if I choose not to return home?" The question had been forming in her mind throughout their conversation. Her father's smile was sad but understanding. "I suspected as much when I heard you had been at Blackthorn's side throughout his recovery. There's something between you, isn't there?" "Yes," she admitted, the simple truth both frightening and liberating. "Though we've barely acknowledged it ourselves. He's a good man, better than I was to your mother." The Baron rose, approaching cautiously. "Whatever you decide, know that you have my blessing, and my deepest apologies for failing you so profoundly." When he opened his arms, Thalia found herself stepping into her father's embrace for the first time in years. The reconciliation was tentative, fragile, but it was a beginning. Later, as summer twilight painted the gardens of Hampstead Lodge in soft gold, Thalia related the conversation to Evander. He had insisted on sitting outside, claiming fresh air would speed his recovery. In truth, Thalia suspected he simply tired of confinement. Your father surprised me, he admitted, watching her expression carefully. He accepted full responsibility without qualification. A new experience for him, I'm sure. She smiled faintly. But genuine, I think. And the contract is officially void? Yes. She studied his face, still pale but regaining strength daily. I am, as my father put it, free of both Brentwood and his poor judgment. Free, Evander repeated. The word weighted with meaning. To return to Ashcroft, to London society, to choose my own path. She took his hand, her decision made long before this conversation. If that path might lead to Blackthorn Manor, would I be welcome? His fingers tightened around hers. You would be more than welcome, Thalia. You would be home. The admission, simple yet profound, moved her more than any grand declaration. Even knowing that rumors will fly, that society will question my time spent in your household. Society's judgment matters little to me. His eyes, clear and direct, held hers. But your happiness matters greatly. I would not have you sacrifice reputation or family connections without certainty. My certainty grows with each day I know you. Emboldened, she continued, I love you, Evander, not for your protection or position, but for the man you've revealed yourself to be. For a moment he appeared stunned, as though such a declaration was beyond his expectation. Then a transformation overtook his features, the careful reserve giving way to naked emotion. I have loved you, he said quietly, since you stood in my library, arguing the merits of Shakespeare while dressed as a chambermaid. Your courage, your intelligence, your compassion, they humble and inspire me daily. He reached into his pocket, withdrawing a small velvet box. I had this brought from Blackthorn Manor. It belonged to my grandmother, who married for love against her family's wishes. Inside lay a ring of unusual design, an emerald surrounded by small diamonds in an intricate gold setting. I offer this not as a nobleman seeking advantage, nor as a protector claiming reward, he said, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes, but as a man who loves you and desires nothing more than to build a life together, as equals in all things. Thalia's vision blurred with tears as he continued, Will you marry me, Thalia Windermere? Not as the Baron's daughter or the Count's wife, but as yourself, the remarkable woman behind all masks and titles. Yes, she whispered, as he slipped the ring onto her finger. With all my heart, yes. 3 months later, the small chapel on the Blackthorn estate witnessed a wedding unlike any in the county's memory. The bride wore not white, but a gown of deep blue silk, modified from Lady Philomena's famous ball gown. The ceremony included no elaborate procession or pretentious display, just the quiet exchange of vows between two people who had found each other against all odds. Baron Windermere, sober and subdued, gave his daughter away with genuine blessing. Lady Philomena dabbed at tears she would later deny shedding. Timothy, now installed permanently at Blackthorn Manor as Evander's ward, served as ring-bearer with solemn dignity. Most notably, the bride and groom wore simple golden half-masks during the ceremony, a symbolic acknowledgement of their beginning and a joyful discarding of pretense as they removed them for their first kiss as husband and wife. No more disguises, Thalia whispered against Evander's lips. No more hiding. Only truth between us, he agreed, from this day forward. As they emerged from the chapel to the cheers of estate workers and local villagers, many of whom had helped protect them during their flight from the Duke, Thalia reflected on the extraordinary journey that had led to this moment. From desperate escape to profound love, from fear to security, from disguise to authentic self. The masks they had worn, both literal and figurative, had fallen away, revealing something far more precious than titles or wealth. Two hearts that recognized themselves in each other, beyond all disguises and pretense. And that, Thalia knew as she stepped into the sunlight on her husband's arm, was the greatest treasure of all.